it's interesting kind of when you look at the landscape of coaching across all professional sports. We have basketball coaches, we have football coaches, we even have hockey coaches, but we have baseball managers. Why do we have that difference?
Right, and I think it's also there's soccer. So if you watch Ted Lasso, right, you know that there's the team manager, and so interesting that both of those sports were the sort of the precursors to professional sports, right? Both of them, and so they called them managers because they weren't thinking of them like coaches back in the 1800s when this started. It was just you were managing the players that were on the field,
and I think it's interesting because I think. Soccer and baseball do share something in common, I think, in the way the coaches interact with the sports. And I'd argue that hockey is actually much the same in that the coach's ability to use his strategy to affect the individual outcome of any one play is pretty low. Baseball is probably, interestingly, the highest of any of those just because of the pinch hitter, reliever kind of setup where the coach can make a decision to switch a player for a specific moment rather than in hockey and in soccer or football, depending on where you are. You're choosing more a substitution for a specific period of time, less a singular moment. So I think it's interesting in that way with baseball because the coach has a lot of impact on strategy, but at the same time, very little impact on strategy.
Well, and any player, will be saying that it's a player's game, right? And the managers know that, and the coaches know, the teams know that. Like, you can prepare them all you want, but once the game is on and it's between the lines or whatever it is, yeah, you can move chess pieces around, but pretty much the guys are playing the game and the women are playing the game, and there you go.
Coaches might have different philosophies, but a baseball team that plays under one manager, in terms of the style of the game they play, is not going to suddenly drastically change if they bring in a new manager. They might play better, but the way in which the team plays is unlikely to change. It's not as if, you're a football team and you bring in a new coach and he changes your defensive system from a 4-3 to a 3-4.
Well, I mentioned Ted Lasso before, and so the season, the whole thing was they completely changed the style of play in the middle of the season, which is insane, right? And then they were thought to be insane. Of course, they won 15 in a row after
it works out
because it's a TV show.
Yeah,
and it get everybody. But the point is that you wouldn't like all of a sudden change your baseball team's style of play at the All-Star break because it isn't working well. We're going to become a running team, and when we weren't a running team or you can't decide to be a power hitting team. You're always trying to hit the ball far.
Yeah, exactly. You'd be like, no, guys, now we're just going to strategize and hit more home runs.
This podcast came out of a question. My partner's son Nile sort of asked us because he knows we do a podcast, and he says, "So what does a baseball manager actually do?" And I assume it's from the perspective of somebody who's a fan of baseball, but maybe not like you and me and many people. But if you looked at it from the outside and looked at, okay, so you see a picture of the manager in the dugout, and if it's the Mets, it's Buck Showalter, it's Aaron Moon. What are they doing?
In a given game? Not a whole lot. Watching, mostly. I think the issue that you run into with managers is exactly that. They're managers. They're not there for any one game. Obviously, the decisions they make in any game is going to, have an effect on the outcome. But look no further than Kevin Cash in the World Series with pulling out his pitcher early in the game because the analytics told him to. And
they had done that all year.
They had done that all year. So
and he gets killed for it still.
Kevin Cash still gets killed for that. But at the same time, that's just one decision that you're making with the addition of stats in terms of the overall outcome. In terms of the manager's effect, ultimately, how good his decision is still impacted by the player's performance. If he pulls out the pitcher, it was McClanahan, right?
No, it was Blake Snell.
It was Blake Snell. He pulls out Blake Snell and they win the game, then they look like geniuses. So,
and you tend to sort of focus on the decisions that go wrong instead of there's like, we brought on this relief pitcher and he pitched 4 scoreless innings, and like the manager gets no credit for that.
Nobody gets credit for bringing. So Verlander pitches 7. We bring in Ottavino in the 8th, and he has a good inning. That's not great move.
Brilliant decision by the manager.
No, it would only be if he brought in anybody. If he brings in Ottavino, then Ottavino yaks it up. Then we're all talking about how it's a terrible decision for bringing in Ottavino. So basically, it's just a lose neutral proposition for the manager.
And I think what the managers, and you're saying this in all sports, what they do, well, from a baseball manager standpoint, to answer Niall's question, it's what they do before the season almost, when they get to spring training. And like Bruce Bochy took over the Rangers this year.
Yeah.
And so the manager's there to try to instill a culture difference from what was going on in Texas before, which they weren't playing well.
Yeah.
They have better players now. So the manager's going to look better in Texas because they've off to a good start. They've got DeGrom, they got Eovaldi, they're hitting, they're scoring.
Objects in the rearview mirror might appear closer than they are with the Astros charging up at
that was just a matter of time. But the point is that I think the manager did have an impact there on the culture of what's going on. And I assume when you hire a guy like that, that's what you're hoping for.
Right. And I think when you look at, in baseball in comparison to the other sports, the manager is there to keep the team on track through the long haul of a 162-game season. And I think that that's something as fans we can never really appreciate or have an understanding of what the grind is like throughout a season. Because to us, the idea of playing baseball every day would be a luxury. That would be a dream come true to do it professionally. But I imagine once you're a 6 or a 7 year pro, you've played a lot of baseball games at that point. So you're not going to wake up in the morning with the same enthusiasm for doing your job that you're going to wake up with when you're a rookie.
Or it won't be as easy to do that. I think the players have to self-motivate to do that.
But a manager needs to create an environment where it's easy to do that, because we've all had toxic workplace environments. You don't look forward to going into work when it's an unenjoyable place to be. So if you have a team that's struggling and a manager that's not controlling the clubhouse, now guys are definitely not thinking about coming in maybe an extra 30 minutes early to do some work, because they're going to limit their time they spend at the park. It doesn't mean they don't do anything, but you're not going to have that team element developing.
And today's baseball, I'd say, is more about the players to a degree, sort of being accountable to each other, and the manager will make you accountable to the manager. But I think the manager's counting on the players, sort of saying, we're going to take care of this internally when something is guys not making the effort the right way or whatever they might see. It's better if the manager does anything, he's going to do it privately, right? So you don't want to do it publicly. And it's even better if the players sort of take care of it. It's like no one's going to say anything. We know what to do.
The hard-nosed disciplinarian just doesn't work anymore. I think one of the things that really hurt that was sort of, at some point, athletes kind of realized, wait a second, why am I letting a guy who can't do the things I can do yell at me?
Oh,
I think that got into people's heads. That unfortunately, you have a lot of coaches that could only ever coach, and they were never players. So there's definitely an element of like, why am I letting somebody who has no idea what it's actually like being out there, do that stuff?
You said two things that struck me. So one, can a guy who wasn't a major league player be an effective manager?
Yes,
100% agree with that. So you're saying, would you think the players would not appreciate the guy who hasn't played the game at the top level, and it'd be more difficult for that manager than somebody who had played?
I think it is. I don't think
Buck Showalter never played Major League Baseball.
But Buck Showalter's learned how to communicate with players. I think it's something that a young manager
I see.
would really have to. It's a skill you have to develop, and I think that's why you've seen pushback and why certain managers don't land, is because if you're a guy if you're a pit manager, right? And you have a pitcher that can't throw a strike. He's like, just throw a strike. It's like, buddy, you get out here and do it.
It's not as easy as it looks.
Right.
And the history of managers, right? Because baseball's been around for so long. You're right. The authoritarian approach that was formerly, the manager was supreme, and they played the players a pittance a lot, for many, many years. And the manager had the ultimate authority to ruin a guy's career if he wanted to.
You could just bury a guy.
Now the assets are so much more expensive. The manager can't do that, right? Because they're being paid so much money.
And the team just won't let them.
They're not going to let them do it. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work. That you can't manage your team in that way where, look what Tony La Russa tried to do late in his career. He tried to be an authoritarian guy, and it didn't play out.
Because part of the reason it worked before was you had a closed ecosystem.
It was 40 years ago is why it worked before.
It was a closed ecosystem.
Yes.
You only had one person who was really able to tell anybody else what was going on there, because a player going out and breaking the sanctity of the locker room would have basically had you blacklisted by the other players. If you as a player came out and started talking trash about how your manager was acting towards you, the other players wouldn't like that. Not because that they necessarily don't agree with you, but if you're willing to speak about what's going on in the locker room, on this thing, you're going to be willing to speak out about other stuff, and they can't trust you anymore. So the only person that could report on it, the team, was the one reporter that was in the locker room, and he certainly wasn't going to say...
Or the beat reporters,
the
right.
beat reporter.
Right,
and they're
right.
not going to say anything. That's
Right, they had an unwritten rule to not out stuff that happened in the locker room.
So the manager had much more of his own little kingdom, whereas now, if a manager... I'm sure if some AA or AAA manager really went off the rails in the locker room one time, that would be posted on... A video of that incident would be posted by somebody within an hour.
And the managers, right, and the managers are not as colorful today because the game doesn't call for them to be as colorful as it used to be. We don't have Earl Weaver running out of the dugout and screaming and yelling at the umpires about a play at second base and then kicking a bunch of dirt on the guy's shoes. And fans, for whatever reason, ate that stuff up, man, and you just rarely see anything like that today.
Right, and now I think people would be like, "Oh my god, like
what's wrong with this guy?"
Yeah, like seriously.
So I think they're not as demonstrative as the point I'm making, and so it makes the fan who doesn't know maybe what's going on going, "Well, what are they doing there?" I mean, they fill out a lineup card and they put in a pinch hitter. Is that pretty much it?
I mean, think about we used to talk about when you see a manager come out and argue with the umpire and get himself thrown out of the game. We're like, "Oh, he's trying to fire his team up."
Right.
Like. What?
Yeah, no, absolutely, because it's the same reason why managers get fired, because you can't fire 26 players or 27 players. So if it isn't going well, you think, well, even if the guy isn't doing a bad job as manager, let's just get rid of him, as the Phillies did last year. Yeah, exactly. I was going the same place. And so you could attribute the fact we brought in Rob Thompson and everything got fixed and we played, but that's too much of an indictment to me on Joe Girardi.
Especially because they're not doing great this year.
Right, but it worked, and so that it'll support that sort of, you make a change, it's better than not making the change.
Sometimes I think what that change is just getting a new culture in there. Having, by getting rid of, also... the badness gets lumped onto the person that leaves. So all the bad vibes, when you get rid of the manager in the middle of the season, the team feels lifted. They're free of it. Like, okay, that's behind us. We don't have to deal with that anymore. And maybe some of the smaller beefs that the manager might not have had anything to do with just get solved by the virtue of a scapegoat has now been removed.
Right, and so that you're getting rid of your evil,
right?
Even though that had nothing to do with it, necessarily. Right. He was just the guy there at the time when it was going badly.
We were talking about before the show any managers that were on the potential hot seat right now, and I was saying up until they started performing better recently, Ollie Marmol of the Cardinals was going to be on the hot seat, I think he still is.
Part of it was because of the way he handled the situation on the field and in the locker room with the player.
Right, and so now they're winning again, so winning soothes all wounds.
Absolutely.
But if they start struggling again, especially before the All-Star break, he'd be somebody I think could go, because it would be really easy for the players to just be to just turn on him and be like, we don't like how he managed it. Get rid of him. Bring in somebody else.
Two other managers who aren't on the hot seat, yet they have less than good teams. And talk about Mark Kotsay with the A's for a second, right? So they're historically bad. They're at a worse pace than the 1962 Mets. No one's talking about firing Mark Kotsay.
Right.
Mark Kotsay, because who's going to go and manage that bunch of guys?
And also, what do you expect Mark Kotsay to do with that
that's
roster?
what I'm saying. And it's the same thing, right.
Like there is a certain level of okay, we can't expect anything from this manager because we're literally handing him not major league.
It might be a double-A team.
Right. and so we can't really expect him to show anything of it. I think it would be different if we had expected literally anything from them,
which
season.
Nobody did before the season. And I think Dave Martinez of the Nationals is another guy.
They're actually they've been pretty good.
They're right there. So I don't want to put them in that category of being as bad, although they're under 500. They don't have much there, and they've done a decent job just staying within 10 games of 500 at this point.
For them, that's
well, and they got the whole ownership situation in Washington. So who's going to come in as a manager and want to take that job? Right, given the circumstances of we don't know who's going to own the team, we don't know what they're going to do.
Yeah, especially because you would think that if they bring in some new owners, that owner is going to want to go out and get their own GM.
You would think, right? And you want to let the GM hire his manager.
And with a Davey Martinez, who's been a major league manager before, he's less concerned about how that he knows if he gets some reason he gets.
We're not bad because I'm a bad manager.
Exactly. If I get let go from Washington because the GM wants to bring his own guy, somebody else is going to hire me.
So I mentioned Earl Weaver before and Billy Martin. If you've seen, the old Yankees and that the toxic Yankee clubhouse of that 77 and 78 team that, everybody was at each other's throats, but all they had to do, like the 72, 3 and 4 A's, was get on the field and play. You didn't want to really talk about it in the locker room. So the managers got thrown out a lot more today, and I started looking at who's getting thrown out of games today, and it surprised me a little bit that Aaron Boone of the Yankees.
He's been getting thrown out like a mad amount recently.
And there have been a good team for a long time, for the whole time he's been there, and he gets a lot of heat as manager. I think unduly so sometimes.
I think, unfortunately, as a Yankee manager, you have exactly one day each year where the fan base is happy with you, and that's the day you win the World Series.
Oh, opening day, too.
Well, no, I mean, I'm pretty sure they were already mad about Boone on opening day this season. They weren't thrilled he was coming back.
He's 30 times in 760 games he's been thrown out, which may seem like a lot. And before that, guys were getting thrown out at a much higher rate when you go back to, what was happening in the 50s and 60s and 70s.
The challenge definitely help reduces the amount of guys. Because one, the existence of the challenge and the ability to replay the replay means that it's way harder for you to fly off the handle on some situation, never really have a good idea of what happened. Back in the 50s and 60s, you had that one chance to see the play, and that was it. You were never seeing it again.
You didn't even see it.
Right, you just saw what happened.
You saw it live.
Right, but now, even if you don't see the replay, they're playing the play again 5 times on the Jumbotron out in the center field. So you're going to be able to see it a couple times, and that's just going to naturally keep you from flying off the handle as much.
I make the analogy all the time that tennis was more exciting when McEnroe and Connors went nuts, on the court. Even Agassi, with questioning line calls and using colorful language and so on and so forth. Once they got automatic line calling, a lot of that dynamic is gone from tennis. We talked about, and that's what's happening in baseball. To your point,
100%. You're going to see even probably fewer manager ejections next season when there's automatic balls and strikes. What are you going to do? Argue with the robot?
And that's what Boone is getting thrown out for, is arguing balls and strikes, which you're not allowed to argue balls and strikes. So why is Boone doing that? I don't really understand. And then after the game, right, when Boone gets thrown out for doing that, he says, do you want ABS? And he goes, oh, no, I don't want ABS. The umpires do a great job. Yeah, because he doesn't want an umpire to not give him a call for the rest of the whole season. He's not that stupid,
And I also think that with the thing with an ABS, as a manager, I would much rather have an umpire behind the plate than ABS. Because I can bully the umpire. I'm going to be able to get calls out of the umpire that I wouldn't be able to get out of the ABS.
Right. In no way should there not be umpires in the field with ABS. It's a tool that I hope they will find a way to use.
But as a manager, having automatic balls and strikes means that you can't, there can't be a day where you just get the call.
You've got a bad strike zone today. No. You've got the same strike zone you have every day. Another guy who got thrown out a lot, and you wouldn't have thought of because he's sort of Mr. Implacid, is Joe Torre. Joe Torre was thrown out of games in the top 10 all the time of managers, and it's just kind of interesting. So it's not the demeanor; it's a put on. Is what I'm trying to say.
100%, it's a put on. You can see, I remember there's a lot of famous clips of managers arguing with the umpire, and I think there's one where he's yelling at him, and he's literally just yelling at him, where are you going for dinner tonight? They're having a conversation about getting.
Yeah, I think Tommy Lasorda or something. Right. I have to get done. Throw me out of the game. Throw me out of the game. And he's telling the umpire throwing because he's trying to get his team fired up, and he's asking. And sometimes you just say the magic word.
Yeah, you just got to say what you can't say. And he's like, look, I'm trying not to have to scream the word I can't say. Just do me a solid, toss me out of the game because I need to get tossed out of the game. The umpire's like, I'm not going to do it unless you say the word.
And think of the other sports, right? Do football coaches ever get thrown out of the game? Never. How about hockey coaches? Ever get thrown out of the game? Nope. Basketball coaches occasionally will get thrown out of the game. I'm not sure why basketball decided soccer managers don't get thrown out of the game.
It makes sense. See, basketball at least makes sense just because basketball lets the coaches get about as close as we
right to the action.
To the action and to the refs. Football, hockey, they're on the bench and the refs are skating around. So it's a lot harder for the hockey coach.
Right, you can't hear them say the magic word.
Right. Football, sometimes it's surprising what they let the football coaches get away with. I have seen Robert Saleh standing next to a referee screaming in his ear and then spike a headset 2 feet from him. Ref doesn't even blink. Imagine if a manager walked out and threw his cap at the umpire's feet. He would be suspended for a week.
And in the NFL, the most you might get is a penalty, like an unsportsmanlike penalty or something like that, I guess.
And you don't typically ever penalize the coaches. They're way more weirdly it's kind of the reverse of baseball, where in baseball, a player could basically pimp whatever home run he wants to whatever degree he wants, and there will never be peep from the umpires. But they will throw the coaches out from the bench for saying something. In football, they'll flag the players for celebrating, and the coach could just be screaming in a ref's ear. They don't do anything.
And the managers also have to decide. So let's say a player is involved in a controversial play. Right, so he's going crazy, and he is one of your good players, I hope. And so the manager's got to go out there and protect his player by getting in between, so that he's the one that gets thrown out and not the player.
Because you're also, and it depends if the player is arguing with the umpire or another player. Because if he's arguing with the umpire, depending on the play, you might just let him go. Because he's probably, unless he does something crazy, he's only going to get a game for that, most likely. But if you see him going after another player, like, this could turn into a fight, and I could lose this guy for like a week.
That's different, right? Yeah, you don't want to get that suspended. So the managers are responsible today much more than before for team culture, I think is what it is.
They're aligning the team philosophically.
Yes. And so, the duties of a manager today are different than they were obviously 50 years ago, because you have to do things like figure out how much music is going to be allowed in the locker room, right? That was, I guess, going on 50 years, but not to the degree that it is today. Everybody's got their music and stuff like that, and you kind of want to let the players manage that kind of stuff, but the manager has to set the tone for what's going to happen when it comes to how the clubhouse is going to be.
What time you're expected to be in.
Right.
What happens if do you give the guys a range? Do you say, I need you here between 1 and 1:30, or do you say you just have to be here by 1:30? It could be things like that, and that's all. And then when a guy is late, how do I deal with that? Because it's one thing if the 25th guy on the roster is late. It's another thing if Francisco Lindor is late one day.
Oh, so you're saying there might be different rules for different players?
Yes, there is.
Yeah.
We all know that.
The old Lawrence Taylor rules for the
Bill Parcells
LT
Giants,
rules.
yeah.
It was different for everybody else because he was LT.
Because exactly. I'm sure if Scherzer was like, you know what, Buck, I don't want to show up until 4:00 today before my start. Buck would be like, oh, sure. Do you need me to send you a taxi? I don't think Tyler McGill would get that same treatment.
And so the general manager, right, has to give the manager the control of the game on the field. Right, so our Mets just brought up the babies, right?
Right.
Beatty and Alvarez and Vientos and maybe Mauricio come up. That's a general manager decision. So the manager, Buck Showalter, is there to deploy the assets he's been given. Now, I'm sure he's consulted, or how are you going to use this player?
I'm sure after bringing up those kids, if none of them played for the week, somebody from the front office would be coming by Buck's office to be like, hey, put the kids in.
But that just doesn't happen anymore because the communication is so much better than it used to be.
Because the only way that could happen is if there was you were Billy Martin and George Steinbrenner, and the owner and the coach actually didn't like each other, and so the coach would just do it to spite the GM for no reason.
But sometimes they liked each other because they got together and got married like 5 times.
Right, exactly. But that would be the difference. That Buck would probably not he's probably sending his lineup card to the front office a lot of the time, and I'm sure they would notice hey, we brought the kids up. Why haven't they been in the lineup?
Yeah, well, that obviously isn't happening.
But you're going to still see the same time. It depends on the front office. I am sure the Rays go to whoever they put in manager and say, hey, we use analytics in a specific way here. There's going to be times where we want you to make an analytics-based decision that you might not have a gut feeling for, and we expect you to go along with that because our team philosophy is to believe in these analytics.
Kevin Cash.
Yeah. Well, I'm saying inevitably when they move on from Kevin Cash,
right.
The next guy will probably be given a similar speech.
So the managers do things like they manage pitching changes. Obviously, they manage defensive alignments. Right? They might have a coach who's signaling that, but they're responsible for that. Pinch runners,
hit and runs,
obviously the bullpens and things of that nature, and in-game strategy. Right? When you're going to hit and run, which not many teams do anymore. When you're going to bunt, you're the manager. You're making those calls.
And things like steals, there might be some players you have a personal green light for, but there'll be times where you're sending a steal in when they're not going.
Right, and I think this year it's even more difficult because the managers are trying to figure out with the pitch clock being in there, how tired are my pitchers getting because they're throwing pitches much more frequently. Is my guy going to get gas sooner? Do I need to go get him sooner?
We kind of saw that. We had that interesting moment yesterday where I think it was Nogasek was pitching for the Mets, and he just had an awful inning. He was giving it up all over the place, and there was clearly a moment where Buck and Pelfrey, who's the pitching coach, decided, get out of it. They weren't going to
take your lumps.
Take your lumps.
We're not going to burn another arm.
We're not going to burn another arm. Get out of this inning. And that's part of being a manager, is that sometimes you almost have to, in baseball, you can't go 162-0. The same way you're never going to win a tennis match loving them out. No points for them at any point. Sure, theoretically it's possible, but it's virtually never going to happen. So you have to understand you're going to give up some losses in a year. And understanding that and managing your resources is another thing the manager does.
Right, and you can't, because you can't fire the players, even if you're a good manager who's got a good reputation, we'll talk about the Mets for a second. So if the Mets go in the tank, right, this season and it doesn't work out, Does Buck Showalter get fired because all of a sudden, what was it? This guy has a managing history
Probably
of being
not.
a very good manager everywhere he's ever gone.
I think he would only get fired if the malaise continued into the first half of next year.
Or there was a culture aspect in the clubhouse
that we are unaware of.
Correct. That was cancerous.
Right.
And
I think because most teams would look at it and go, one bad year is not enough to damn any manager. And teams that generally fire a guy after only a season, especially in baseball, are seen as very hasty.
Right. And I think the managers, to be an all-time manager is very, very based on wins and losses. At the end of the day, we tend to evaluate them.
It's results-based analysis for managers.
It is. Unfortunately, in that it doesn't tell you whether the guy you can manage a 75 and 87 team and have a great season managing that team because they were not a good team and you got every ounce out of that team you could.
But ultimately, because there's no way to go back and see what would have happened had you not made the change that you did, you can only ever be just judged on the results. So you can never go back and be like, well, what if I had left that guy in another inning? We never know. All we know is you pulled him and this happened, so it was either a good or bad decision based on that.
Right. It's only like you said, results-based analysis again. So you have a tough road trip and you're flying back after you've lost, 4 out of 6 and you come. And so the manager had to decide, do I give him an off day or do I bring him in and make him practice? Now, at the major league level, and we'll talk about this in a second, so it made me think of outside of major league managing, it's a very different way of managing than managing at any other level of baseball.
Managing major league baseball is very different than managing anywhere else.
Because the players can manage themselves to a large degree, unlike other levels.
And they're also invested in their assets in a way in that you're not at any other level, except for the absolute top prospects. If you're the managing at the minor league level is probably a lot closer to the 50s, 60s, 70s style of managing than modern Major League Baseball.
Well, and I think you're responsible even more for the culture there to elevate, as I always say, the two guys you really think are important to your minor league team.
At the same time, as a minor league manager, you are also probably way more beholden to requests from ownership.
100%.
There will be times where you know that playing a certain guy is not good for you.
Don't pitch him tonight. Right?
You got to go. Okay.
And that's the thing about minor league baseball. It's so hard to be a fan because you are a pawn to the major league team, and so you could be having a great minor league season, and all of a sudden, we're going to just pluck your best players because we need them for the big club, and all of a sudden, your brilliant minor league season, your fans are loving coming and watching your team win. Your team's not any good anymore, and they can sink to the bottom. And well, that's the way it is for minor league baseball. Another thing that strikes me, I want to think about. So you're a minor league baseball manager, but you're a college baseball coach. You're a high school baseball coach. So at some point you graduate from being a coach to being a manager when you get to be a professional. Is that?
I think that's what it is.
I don't know why. Why would you have both? I don't understand.
But they still call Showalter Coach Buck Showalter. Not rarely. Though. Manager.
He's manager. Yeah. He's a manager. And the same thing in soccer. We call them soccer coaches in high school, right? And college, the soccer coach. Nobody in the U.S. calls him the team manager. It's a UK thing. Yeah. Whatnot. So I just find that to be very interesting. So do you think that we see Dusty's we talked about this in our Hall of Fame episode 115. We thought Dusty was going to be there. I was thinking about another manager who had a better managing career in Dave Johnson, who managed the Mets to the World Series championship in '86 and was a winner wherever he went. I just think it's so hard for managers to get into the Hall of Fame unless you've got
you got to be a character,
and you got to have multiple World Series wins, probably
multiple World Series wins, and you got to be a bit of a character. You have to
hopefully not in Dusty's case because he's only got one.
Right, but you have to have a bit of that persona. You have to have that thing that people remember you for.
Yeah.
That makes you stand out because otherwise it's way too easy to just be like, well, yeah, of course anybody won those World Series when you manage all those good teams.
And to your point, so that's what's harder and harder about being a manager because you're actually supposed to be more milquetoast today as a manager, right? You're not as demonstrative. You're not getting thrown out of the game. You're basically jiggling the lineup card, but the players are supposed to sort of handle things themselves in a way because they're being paid a lot more than the manager now as opposed to the way that it used to be. So you can't be domineering, and so you end up not having as much personality because you're not there to get quotes, after the game or in the press or whatever it might be.
It's just different.
Right. So managers have a lot to do that you don't watch. I think you can't really see.
The thing. The majority of the manager's work is stuff that happens outside the fans' eyes. So the only parts of their game that do get people generally judge managers and what it looks like to us they do
Right.
Is they make
Why
pitching
didn't he go to
changes
the left-hander in the 8th inning?
and send up pinch hitters?
Right.
And set the lineup.
That's
each
what
day.
if you don't know better, that's what you think the manager's doing.
There's a lot more they're doing behind the scenes.